Good morning and welcome to Search of Scriptures. Go ahead and open to the book of 1 Samuel. We began a few weeks ago looking through the Bible and searching through the Bible and studying through the Bible together. We began in Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 begins the Bible in what has to be the best and only way to begin it. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God created. And then we see that not only did He create, but He created a perfect environment, but man, we blew it. Adam and Eve did what they were not supposed to do and broke that relationship with God, which separated your and my relationship with God. We didn't inherit their sin, but we inherited the consequences of their sin as far as separation from God and being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And when we sin, then we find ourselves separated from God on an individual level. It's the soul that sins that will die, Ezekiel says. So now we are faced with that situation in our lives, and we need to return to God. And we see that then in Genesis, beginning in chapter 3, God begins to provide and prepare a way for man to be reunited with Him. Men begin to sacrifice animals, and the blood, it becomes a sacrifice for sin. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. But we see that God is preparing Himself, His Son, to be the ultimate sacrifice. And we see that scheme, that plan in the book of Genesis as a promise is made to Abraham about his seed, and about the nations coming to God through His seed. We see that people taking shape in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then we see that people getting their land in Joshua and in Judges. We see their problems as they follow God and don't follow God and follow God and don't follow God 16 times over and over again. We see one story out of that period of Judges in the life of Ruth, a Moabitess who is faithful to God and receives her rest. And then we come to 1 and 2 Samuel. The nation here begins to change. Samuel is a prophet, the last of the judges. And so as we continue, we come to 1 and 2 Samuel, and these two books could produce weeks and weeks and weeks of material just to themselves. But we're not going to be here that long. We want to look at some highlights of these two books, some things that I think are particularly interesting. They record some of the early history of the former prophets and of the nation of Israel. They tell of the close of the period of Judges and the beginning of the period of the kings to rule Judah and to rule Israel. In Samuel's books, we meet the first two kings, Saul and David. The tall, handsome Saul and the ruddy shepherd, David. Samuel begins not with the kings, but with his own story. It's in 1 Samuel 1 through 3 that Samuel's mother, Hannah, is one of the two wives of a God-fearing man by the name of Elkanah. Hannah, though loved by her husband, felt like a second-class wife because she had no children. She prays to God for a child. And we read in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11. And she vowed a vow, saying, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Eli was a priest, a prophet of God at the time. He witnesses Hannah's prayer, but does not hear her, though her mouth moves. He accuses her of being drunk in God's house, and she explains, and Eli tells her that she will have her answer from God in an affirmative way. Hannah conceives the child from Elkanah, and when the son is born, she names him Samuel, which means heard by God. Hannah remembers her pledge to God, and when Samuel is weaned, she honors her pledge and she brings him to the house of God. Look at verses 26 and 27 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I'm the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Hannah dedicated. She sacrificed, lent her son to God's service. This sounds like an extremely hard thing to do. As a parent, it's hard enough to leave your child for a week, a few hours, let alone for a lifetime, only to bring them coats as they're needed. Chapter 3 tells what is one of my favorite stories. Well, one of my favorite stories as a young child. I used to dream that I was Samuel serving Eli, and I don't know that that means anything. But you remember what happens? Samuel is serving Eli, and he hears her voice saying, Samuel, and he gets up and he runs to Eli 3 times, and Eli says, it's not me, go back to bed. And finally he says to him, look, here's what you say if you hear the voice again. So he hears the voice again, and Samuel says, speak, Lord, your servant hears. And God reveals that Samuel will be his prophet, his priest, his servant to Israel. And you read that in chapter 3, verses 19 through 21. But soon, Israel no longer wanted judges and prophets to lead them. They wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted kings like the nations around them, so they longed to be like them. And Samuel feels rejected, that they have turned against him as their leader. And God says, no, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Give them a king. And he warns them what this king will be like. But the people did not want to hear. They didn't care about the forewarned consequences of what a king would mean to them. They wanted to be like everybody else. So Saul becomes the first king of Israel, and soon they would understand God's warning because he became everything that God had warned them that a king would be. In many ways, Saul would lead them away from God instead of toward God. As Saul's terror continues, he defiantly disobeys God. God rejects him as king and eventually replaces his spirit with a distressing spirit in the life of Saul. God, in the meantime, sends Samuel to the house of Jesse to find the next king. Jesse, you'll remember, is the son of Obed, who is the son of Ruth and Boaz. God tells Samuel as the first son approaches, do not look on his appearance, the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as a man sees, for the Lord looks at the heart, not at the outward appearance. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. 7 sons are refused, but the 8th son is the youngest, the smallest apparently, a shepherd in the field, and his name is David. As promised, David is a man after God's own heart. Paul will later quote that passage of 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14 in Acts 13 and verse 22 in a sermon about Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus was the seed of David. We see Christ even in the book of Samuel. As we move on, we get to 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, we begin to see Christ again from a prophetic nature, from a prophetic message to David. Look at 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 16. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. Your throne shall be established forever. Even though David would make mistakes, God would promise to take care of his descendants. So a few chapters later, we have what may be one of the saddest accounts in David's life. Maybe one of the saddest accounts in the Bible. Here's a great spiritual leader. A man after God's own heart. A man who would lead the people to be a great people, uniting the tribes under one king. And he makes a series of poor decisions that result in sin and severe consequences. From 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we have the events surrounding David and Bathsheba. Real quickly to remind you, here's what happens. It's the time when kings go out to war, but David stays behind. And as he stays behind, he goes out at midday and he's looking over the city. And there on a rooftop where women normally would bathe, he sees Bathsheba bathing. She's something to look at. So he sends for her. He should have just stopped right there and go, wow, she was pretty, and gone about his way, but he didn't. He kept looking and he sent for her. She comes. They have a sexual relationship. she conceives. David says, I've messed up. We need to cover this up. So he calls for her husband Uriah to come back from the battlefront to report what's going on. And then after he reports, he sends Uriah home to his wife, but Uriah won't go into his wife while his brothers are out in the battlefield. So he sleeps on the street. David has him back, gets him drunk, and tries to get him to do the same thing, but he won't. He continues to stay on the street. So David has Uriah sent back to the battle and sent to the front lines, and he tells his commander, when the battle's at its fiercest, back everybody up but Uriah. And it happens. Uriah is killed. David, a man after God's own heart, sins. David, the one who spared Saul's life on a number of occasions because it was not right to take it, plans and carries out the murder of a woman's husband. David, a shepherd who guarded his father's sheep from theft, steals another man's pet lamb. That is the story that Nathan told David, by the way. You're the man, David. You're the one who did this. How can someone through whom Christ will come do such a thing? Why did David allow lust to take control of his life momentarily? Why did he not trust God? Simple. He made poor decisions. David chose to stay home when it was time for kings to go to war. David chose to look a second time. David chose to invite her in, and Bathsheba chose to accept. It is our daily decisions that impact our spiritual well-being. It is our daily decisions that play an important role. We are God's people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and our decisions must reflect that. When David realized the error that he had made, when he realized his sin, we again see the heart of the man of God. Look at Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. He was truly repentant. God forgave. And through Bathsheba would come the next king of Israel, Solomon. Through Bathsheba came the King of Kings, Jesus, Matthew chapter 1. Real quickly, like Hannah, God sacrificed his son to serve. Jesus came to serve and not to be served. He served, giving up his life, John 3:16. God still calls us to service like he called Samuel, not with the spoken word, but through his written word and the word that became flesh and dwelt among us. Israel let the world around them influence them to do what was wrong, and we need to be careful not to want to be like the world. Remember, we're in the world, but not of the world. All the things that are in the world are against God. You can't be a friend of the world and a friend of God, John says in 1 John. God forgave David, and Christ came through his lineage. God will forgive us when we mess up, if we will turn back to him. Thank you for joining us as we have searched the scriptures this week, as we have studied through the books of Judges, Ruth, and 1 and 2 Samuel. Next time we're together, we'll pick up with 1 and 2 Kings and go as far as we can. I thank you for joining us as we have studied this week. Until the next time we're together, may God continue to bless your life.